Alright, I'm back with this. Punishment, regendering, and shame. The Spanish priests, viewing themselves in loco parentis, approached the Joyas' behaviors through the twin disciplinary actions of physical and spiritual punishment and regendering. Both of these terms are euphemisms for violence. The the consequences for being a Joya, whether dressing as a woman, doing a woman's work, partnering with a normative male, or actually being caught in sexual liaisons with a man, included flogging with a leather whip, braided leather typically as thick as a fist, time in the stocks, and korma, a kind of hobbling device that restricted movement but allowed the Indians to work, and forced extended rote repetition of unfamiliar prayers on knees, verbal harassment and berating, ridicule and shaming in front of the joyous community were other forms of discipline. The Ten Commandments were beaten into Indians who spoke fragmented Spanish by priests who spoke little if Indian language, so misunderstandings were frequent and devastating. In a culture where corporal punishment was unknown, even for children, the Spaniards quickly learned that the punishment of Indians was with lashes. In the case of old and married, produces shame and sarza of mind, so that at times the victim dies of chagrin and melancholy, or desert to the mountains, or if women are rejected by their husbands. As joyas, or sorry, end quote, as joyas were treated like women by their tribal communities, married or partnered to normative men, they too would be subject to rejection by their partners or community. Father Barscana wrote that joyas, quote, being more robust than the woman, were better able to perform the arduous duties required of the wife, and for this reason they were often selected by the chiefs and others, and on the day of the wedding a grand feast was given. End quote. Often, joyas were driven from their communities by tribal members at the instigation of the priests and made homeless. This, often a lifetime of esteem and high status, must have been a substantial blow to both physical and well-being and emotional health. In one case, Father Palu described a group of natives visiting at Mission Santa Clara. Soldiers and priests noticed that one native among the women was actually a man. Father Palu wrote, quote, among the Gentile Indian women who always worked separately and without mixing with the men, there was one who, by the dress who was decorously worn, and by the heathen headdress and adornments displayed, as well as the manner of working, sitting, etc., had all the appearances of a woman, but judging by the face and absence of breasts, though old enough for that, they concluded that he must be a man, but that he passed himself off always for a woman, and always went with them and not the man. Taking off his aprons, they found that he was more shamed than if he really had been a woman. They kept him there 3 days, making him sweep the plaza, but giving him plenty to eat. But he remained very cast down and ashamed, after he had been warned that he was not right for him to go about dressed as a woman, and much less thrust himself in with them, as it was presumed he was sinning with them. They let him go. So, I'm assuming they let him go because they just thought it was a ploy just to get with women. That might not be the reason, but it sounds like it's implying that. He immediately left the mission and never came back to it, but from the converts, it was learned that he was still in the villages of the Gentiles and about as before, dressed as a woman. Close reading thrust himself in suggests that the priests and soldiers completely misunderstood the situation and assumed that this man was sinning, that is, sneaking into women's work area dressed as a woman to flirt and have sex with them. The idea that a man would choose to dress and work as a woman with other women and that the community accepted and in fact benefited from that choice was inconceivable to the Spaniards. Probably because of the misunderstanding, this Joya was able to escape and find another community, at least temporarily. After a taste of regendering by the Spaniards, no doubt even unfamiliar villages looked better than remaining with one's own family and friends. At this point in the missionization process, leaving for life with the Gentiles was still a possibility. As time went on and escapes like this one above became less viable, Joyas trapped in the missions are brought in as adults by raiding parties suffered from a kind of social dislocation that must have been deeply troubling for individuals accustomed to a rich but specialized community network. Pre-contact native Californian societies operated under a gender separation that generally kept men and women working at separate tasks away from the opposite sex most of the day. Women had their work areas and were accustomed to withdrawing to them to weave, harvest, process, and prepare food, care for children, and so on. Joyas were always a part of this woman's world and did not cross over into the men's territory. The mission priests, however, demanded that Joyas spend all their time in masculine company, doing masculine work, rather than in the company of women and benefiting from the camaraderie, friendships, and sense of worth found there. Aside from the emotional shock of being cut off from friends and community, Joyas were also faced with what to them was an inappropriate mixing of genders. In a culture where work and play were gendered activities, although not necessarily gendered as the Spanish would think of them, being forcibly placed in the wrong group would have been both extremely uncomfortable and unfamiliar for Joyas. Remember that Father Palu remarked of the Joya found in his mission, quote, taking off his aprons, they found that he was more shamed than if he had been a woman, quote, end quote. Sorry about that. In a kind of involuntary gender reassignment, Joyas were made to dress as men, act as men, and consort with men in contexts for which they had little, if any, experience. For the normative men having Joya among them all day and night, let alone someone stripped of appropriate clothing, status, and respect, must have also been disturbing and further disruption of cultural significance. Women, too, would have noticed and missed the presence of Joyas within the smaller, interdependent feminine community. As a consequence of this regendering, renaming, and murder, one of the Joyas' most important responsibilities on which the well-being of the tribe depended was completely disrupted. Prohibited by the priest, the complex and deeply spiritual position of undertaking became a masterful example of colonial colonization by appropriation. Replacement. Most research on the indigenous third gender agrees that hold on. Most research on indigenous third genders agree that a person living this role had a particular responsibility to the community, especially ceremonial and religious events and tasks. In California, death and burial and mourning rituals were the exclusive province of the Joyas. They were the undertakers of their communities. As the only members of California Indian communities who possessed the necessary training to touch the dead or handle burials without endangering themselves or the community, the absence of Joyas in California Indian communities must have constituted a tremendously disturbing crisis. As Sandra E. Holloman states, quote, perhaps most profoundly, the institution of Catholic burial programs and designated mission cemeteries would have usurped the traditional responsibilities of the Acqui Venterino Chumash word for Joya. The imposition of Catholic practices in combination with the tremendous high death rate among mission populations would undoubtedly have contributed to the disintegration for the guild. End quote. It is hard to overstate the chaos and panic the loss of their undertakers must have produced for indigenous Californians. The journey to the afterlife was known to be a prescribed series of experience with both male and female supernatural entities, and the Acqui, with their male-female liminality, were the only people who could mediate these experiences. Since the female, earth, abundance, fertility, energies were so powerful, and since the male, sun, death-associated energies were equally strong, the person who dealt with that moment of spiritual and bodily crossing over between the life and death must have specially endowed spiritual qualities and powers, not to mention long-term training and their own quarantine tools. Baskets used to scoop up the earth of a grave, for example, were given to the Acqui by the deceased person's relatives as partial payment for burial services, but also because they could never again be used for the life-giving acts of cooking or gathering. The threshold of death was the realm of the Acqui, and no Californian Indian community was safe or complete without that mediator, asserting that undertakers were exclusively Acqui or post-menopausal women, also called Acqui. Holloman speculates that perhaps, quote, the mediation between death and the afterlife and between human and supernatural realms was entrusted by the Chumash to individuals who could not be harmed by symbolic pollution of the corpse and who are no longer or never have been capable of giving birth. End quote. Holloman's archaeological work allows us to understand that the third gender status of Joya may have been extended in some fashion to postmenopausal women as well, should they desire to pursue a career as undertaker. Another strong possibility is that elderly woman stepped into the role of undertaker when when persecution reduced the availability of Joyas. With the loss of the Acqui, then, came an instant and urgent need for some kind of spiritual protection and ritualization of death. This would have suited the Roman Catholic Church, which had more than enough ritual available, and priests were anxious to institute new rituals to replace what they regarded as pagan practices. While founding the San Francisco Mission, Fray Paulo wrote, quote, those who die as pagans, they cremate, nor have we been able to stop this, end quote. Indicating that burial, as tribes farther south practiced, was the only mortuary practice considered civilized. At these same cremations, in reference to funeral rituals, Paulo noted that, quote, there are some old women who repeatedly strike their breast with a stone. They grieve much and yell quite a bit, end quote. It would have been difficult to tell an elderly Joya dressed as a woman from an elderly woman if one did not know of the connection between Joya and the death ceremony. In fact, years later, when Harrington interviewed Maria Solares, a Chumash survivor of Mission Santa Ynez, and one of his major consultants, she told him that all undertakers, Acqui, were women strong enough to carry bodies and dig deep graves, and that the role was passed from mother to daughter. Harrington pointed that the Ionesono word for Johto was also Akwi, that it was strange that, quote, women should be so strong to lift bodies, end quote. And Solaris agreed, though still puzzled. It seems that by the mid-1930s, the memory of Akwi as beloved members of the community no longer matched Solaris' cultural undertakings or understanding of Johto. The long-term damage of homophobia was substantial even in linguistic terms, let alone human terms. It is not hard for me to imagine my ancestors fearing for their spiritual well-being, their loved ones, and what remained of their communities. Turning to Catholicism out of desperation, as the diseases and violence of colonialization took their toll, communities were under intense pressure about the many burials or cremations to be carried out. The turn to and dependence on Catholic burial rituals was a form of coerced conversion that had nothing to do with Christianity and everything to do with fear. Through these messages, then, murder, renaming, regendering, and replacement, the Joya gendercide was carried out. The destruction seems to cover every aspect of Joya identity and survival. Yet I argue Joya identity did not disappear entirely. Surviving gendercide. How could Joya survive such a devastation? Where are they? What is their role in contemporary California Indian life? First, it is important to note that mission records show baptisms of adult Joyas as late as 1832, almost 60 years after Fagus expressed his outrage in 1775. Quote, late arrivals to the mission, adult Indians who, having lived most of their lives as wild Indians, were rounded up and brought in for forced baptism, actually slowed the missionization process considerably. In combination with the low life expectancy of mission-born children, 2 to 7 years, a strong influx of adult indigenous cultural practices probably also kept the role of Joya from fading away as quickly as might otherwise be expected, allowing younger Indians to witness or know Joyas, as well as pass on that information orally to future generations. Second, just as the extermination of California Indians, while extensive, has been exaggerated as complete, so too is the idea that Joyas could be gendercided out of existence. A Joya's conception does not depend on having a Joya parent, unlike normative male and female sexes, who depend on both male and females for conception. As long as enough of the normative population remains alive and able to bear children, the potential for Joya gender to emerge in some of those children also remains. To exterminate Joyas entirely, all California Indian people would have to do is they would have to be killed, down to the very last. Thus, it makes sense that during missionization and post-secularization, as in the past, Joyas rose out of the general population spontaneously and regularly. However, those Joyas had virtually no choice but to hide their gender, like Pablo tribes who took their outlawed religious ceremonies underground until it was safe to practice more openly, although outsiders are understandably rarely allowed to partake or witness the ceremonies. Joyas in California may have taken a similar tactic, removing themselves from ceremonial roles with religious connotations and hiding out in the general population. Sadly, the traditional blend of spiritual and sexual energy that was the source of Joya empowerment suffered an abrupt division. As time passed and a few surviving elder Joyas passed on, younger Joyas would have been forced to function without role models, teachers, spiritual advisors, or even eventually oral stories of their predecessors. Walter Williams reports that he could, quote, he could not find any traces of a Joya gender in oral traditions among contemporary California Indians from missionized tribes, end quote, but adds, quote, that does not mean that a recognized and respected status for Bardache no longer existed or that some same-sex behavior vanished. To find evidence of such community is extremely difficult. Williams outlines three major obstacles to finding such evidence. Inability of surviving Joyas to use written language or refusal once it was introduced, resulting in a lack of documentation, the need for extremely specialized and culturally sensitive oral ethnographies for contemporary research, with some may take part in community conservations, and the backlash against earlier kinds of research that left indigenous people distrustful and unwilling to share sensitive material. Williams' research in South America suggests that a division of the third gender occurred there, perhaps as a conscious effort to, quote, remove the Bardaches from a public institutionalized role to protect them from the Spanish wrath, end quote, resulting in new distinct groups, each with distinct roles. One group are those who identify as, quote, homosexual, end quote, males who prefer sexual partners as men, but who often marry women later in life to attain acceptance and status within their birth families. Oh yeah, people just want to be accepted, and yeah, of course people hide in a closet because of that. I'm sure people, just like trans people have done recently, gay people probably have committed suicide because they weren't allowed to come out and expected to just be normal. Anyways, this group does not participate in any ceremonial or religious activity. The other group consists of a switch from traditional shamanism, with its association with male sex, to powerful, oftentimes physically androgynous shamans or spiritual leaders whose birth sex is female and who identify as women, often married with children, but just as often unmarried or postmenopausal. Quote, so strong was the association of femininity with spiritual power that if the androgynous males could not fill the role, Williams writes, end quote, Williams writes, then the Indians would use the next most spiritual powerful persons. In striving for effective spirituality, they responded in a creative way to Spanish genocidal pressures, end quote. By dividing sexual and spiritual power, indigenous people were able to reflect some of the violence visited on those original individuals, yet maintain living connections with essential powers of life and death. Neither a traditional nor an ideal solution, such a split was nevertheless necessary for tribal survival. I suggest that a similar survival strategy evolved among missionized California Indians, that those people who may have identified as or have been identified as Joyas experienced the spiritual sexual split in one of the two ways. They became either closeted same-sex Jodos who engaged in secret sexual relationships with other men, or they became adult male or female members of the community with important roles as caretakers and grave tenders of native cultures who chose to remain single, that is, unmarried to normative genders throughout life. Traces of a split Joya gender, I argue, can be found from the time of the gendercide to the present day, if not in our oral tradition, then in the libraries and documentation of our colonizers, as well as in our own two-spirit bodies. For examples illustrative of this split are outlined below. I find it interesting, this concept of menopausal women also being like the intermediacy. Like, it almost seems like contradictory in some way because they can't have children and they're the fertile life bearers, but they're still biologically women, and I think that's what the one half of the femininity is, even though you can't have children. And the concept of not having children is the masculine energy. I don't know, like, that's my guess. It's probably rolled around that. So it's interesting that, like, so this is totally a tangent, and stick around, guys. You can, uh, but I was just thinking of, like, the grandmother hypothesis. Like, in nature, how some species, once they are old and have children, they just die because they can no longer be useful. But some species, they reach menopause and they have some use in their families. And obviously, human families, they're breaking down and becoming smaller as we ruin ourselves. However, you wish to think about that, for better or worse. Um, there is some use in our species, even back then, for menopausal women. And we would like to, Darwinianists would probably think, well, they're useless, but um, no, not until you convince people that their economic potential is tied to giving birth. You just kind of kill people at that point because there's a time when they're not going to be, obviously. So I think it's very nice and almost sweet, that our nature has given us the ability to think about people who can't have children in this way. It's just nice. All right. Quetzalcoatl Fernando Librado, a Chumash man born early in 1839, became a primary consultant for Harrington. Librado lived his long life as a person who adapted from someone who might have been Acqui or Joya in an earlier time to what seems to be a kind of cultural caretaker, collecting and preserving stories, technologies, and histories. Born at the end of mission life into the chaos of uh, secularization, Librado would not have been allowed to become a Joya, even if he could have found enough of the community to support him in his efforts. However, Librado fulfilled many of the spiritual roles of the Joyas. In oral material gathered by Harrington, Librado comments frequently on his intense desire to learn as much about his dying culture's knowledge as possible, tracking down Chumash doctors and quizzing Chumash women about plants, wild harvesting, and how to uh, prepare traditional foods, ceremonies, and songs. Librado traveled widely to attend Chumash dances, sings, storytellings, or ceremonies to observe and learn. Significantly, his hunger for knowledge encouraged him to cross male and female gender boundaries, not limiting his research by labels such as men's work or women's work. Librado never married, never had children, and never spoke of having ever been partnered. So most people would just probably call him gay, I guess, right? You can still just be a loner in that way. It doesn't have to mean that, but uh, yeah. Even when discouraged or uh, chastised by other Indian people, Librado persisted in his own form of research. Repeatedly throughout his narrative in Breath of the Sun, he spoke of scenes like this, quote, Francisca asked me why I wanted to learn the swordfish dance songs, and then she said to me, you should abandon the idea. I replied, what is the matter with it? And Francisca told me, it is not good. You better abandon the idea. But Librado was persistent and well versed in Indian etiquette, gathering up valuable gifts of food and drink. He visited another home. Quote, Donosiana and Nalberto knew the Indian dances too. I once went over to Donosiana's house, taking with me some marrow, guts, tripe, and other inner things of a beef. Inner things. I don't know if that's supposed to be thighs, but that's just inner things. Okay. Along with some bread and wine. I wanted to learn the swordfish dance. After the meal, I asked her to teach me old dances, saying, quote, for you are the only one left who know the old dances. Donicia began to cry, and I left saying nothing more. End quote. Such refusal and grief among his own people must have been difficult to bear. Yet Liberato continued collecting knowledge and storing it away. While Liberato was not able to act as an actual undertaker, tending to dead bodies, departing spirits, and their final needs, he did in many ways act as an undertaker for his culture, gathering indigenous cultural knowledge and caring for those scattered pieces. As traditional Joyas protected the people and community through their tending of the dead, as Liberato protected his people and community through his tending of what culture the dead had left behind, he had no idea that someone like Harrington would come along. Liberato was simply compelled to care for his culture. Remember that in Librato's time it was easy to believe that this world had come to an end. Anglos and Indians alike were under the influence of the notion of manifest destiny, which preached the inevitable and imminent death of all things Indian. Ultimately, Liberato told much of what he knew to Harrington, knowing that it would be recorded, both in writing and in early sound recordings, and preserved perhaps until descendants came to claim it. In other words, Liberato gave the remnants of his culture, all that he could gather in his long and determined lifetime, a good burial, a good place to rest, rather than let the pieces lie scattered all over the ground, without prayers, ritual, proper care. While I can't do more than speculate about Librato's decision to remain unmarried and without children, when considered together with his caretaking, his chosen role seems to be that of an Acqui who adapt, at, uh, adapted to the times in order to best serve his community's spiritual needs. In fact, when Maria Solares from Santa Ynez discussed the word Acqui with Harrington, she told him that Liberato was Acqui, meaning homosexual. Quote, he stayed with men and would go crawling to other men in the night. End quote. Oh. Here we see clearly the spiritual sexual split of Joya's role. Solaris knew about the queerness, and she knew about undertakers. But until Harrington pointed out that the two roles shared the same word, she did not realize the connection between the two. At the same time, Solaris, by her use of what she thought of as the word faggot, indicates that she knew something of Liberato's more private life that, together with his efforts as a cultural undertaker, seems to point to his living adaptation of the traditional Acqui role. We glimpse the sexual side of the Joyous split in those field notes from Harrington mentioned earlier in this essay, in two brief comments by his consultant Isabel Meadows from Mission Carmel, following one of my transliteration and translation of those notes. Transliteration. Isabel, March 1934. Estefan Real Tana Muchos Maridos. Her children had many fathers. Eran Jotos las Viaja antes. Isabel, March 1937. Understands Jotas above to mean that the Viajas aren't Masharas, but no, the real reason Isabel used Jotas in 34 was because La Estefana had a son, Victor Acido, who was Joto. Nunca sider nadala viaja Estefana o ni sabia quasi what? Quo su hijo Victor era Joto. This was why in 1934 Isabel spoke of Estefan as my Jotora. She had a son who was Joto. Translation: Isabel, March 1934. Estefan Real had many husbands. Her children had many fathers. They were Jotoras, the old ladies before. Isabel, March 1937, understands Jotoras above to mean that the old women were very macho. But no, the real reason Isabel used Jotora in 34 was because Estefana had a son, Victor Acido, who was a faggot. The old lady Estefana never said nothing, or she didn't know, maybe, that her son Victor was a faggot. That was why in 34 Isabel spoke of Estefana as very macho. She had a son who was a faggot. These are not just names out of an ethnologist's old field notes, nor are these details simply interesting. If belated, gossip from tribal consultant. I am related to Isabel Meadows by marriage. In addition, Estefan Real was born in 1809 at the Carmel Mission. Her sister Josepha Chepa Real, born in 1812, was my great-great-great-great grandmother. Victor Acido, my cousin, is the Joto under discussion. It's true what Isabel said about Estefana Real. She had at least 9, possible 11 children by at least several men whose names are sometimes recorded, sometimes not. She began having babies in 1825 and kept it up through 1848. Nice. Victor, born Nestor Vittorino Antonio, was given the surname Real at his baptism on March 4th, 1846. Fray Doratio Ambris officiated. Estefana did not declare Victor's paternity at the baptism. The father's name is listed as incognito. Oof. I don't know if that's a good thing. But Padre Ambris noted Pavulo child de Razan Real, indicating that the father was de Razan, or of reason, meaning European as well as of real, the priest. The sketchy material is normal for this time period, during the post-secularization era of the California missions. Life was a gamble, and chaos was the everyday challenge. Stephen W. Heckel, a scholar who has studied Mission San Carlos intensively, writes, quote, by 1833, only about 220 Indians lived at San Carlos. The most skilled and independent had left or died. An untold number had never been born because of the sterility of many San Carlos residents. Of those at the missions, nearly half were under age 20 and third were over 40, leaving just about 24 men between the ages of 20 and 39. Too small to be an economically reproductive community, the mission had become a decaying congregation of families and dependents, and an increasingly dilapidated place where people often competed with one another for food. Alright. I will be back in the next one, guys. Oh, peace.